This conference will now be recorded.
Barb, are we ready to go? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the October meeting of the Cape Carteret Planning Board. First thing on the agenda is to call the meeting to order. Second on the agenda is the consent agenda. I'm sure everybody had a chance to look at the minutes from September 27th meeting. Any changes that were submitted went to Barb already, so there shouldn't be any problem with that. The change I made was to appropriately name Neil Mr. Fitzpatrick instead of Fitzgerald. So, all in favor of consent agenda? Thank you. Okay, third is a little bit of kind of leftover from what we had at the last meeting, the table of permitted uses. We went through that and scrubbed it and sent the everything went to Frank, and he kind of put together what we were doing. Everybody had a chance to look through that. So what I'm going to do is kind of open the floor for any changes to what we currently have in our package.
Chair Hall, if I could, before you do that,
Yep.
could I just take a moment and just explain a couple of things to folks, just to make sure that everybody's understanding correctly. As you probably saw, I put it in ordinance format. So if you all approve this tonight, this is what will go to the Board of Commissioners for their formal consideration at a future meeting. And certainly if you want to adjust it in any way and make any changes, we can make those, but it will look basically like this going forward to the Board of Commissioners. I took the feedback that the group provided at the last meeting in September. And so for the R10, R10M, R13, R20, R30, B10, and B20 categories, that should be consistent with the discussions that you all had at your meeting, I think on September 27th. I took the liberty in the B30 category. We didn't talk about that because we only have one parcel that is zone B30 and it's intended for industrial. It's that Culligan property on the edge of town on Highway 24. But I went through it and I essentially looked at the preferences that you all indicated on the worksheets that you returned, combined that input with my own thoughts about that. Also thought about the industrial zone and the fact that perhaps we would want to reserve any industrial property for an actual industrial use, and therefore if it was more of a retail type use, I suggested that we just delete it altogether, generally speaking. But I wanted to just point out to you what my thought process was there. Regardless of whether you agree with my thought process or your colleagues' thought process, or whether you want to change some things, I would just suggest to you it's probably not worth getting overly concerned about anything in that B30 category because we have one parcel zoned that. It's currently developed. And in the future, when you're considering potentially any rezonings to the B30 category, obviously you can consider that in great detail at that time. So regardless of whether you like the recommendations here or don't, we'll change whatever the group's consensus is on those. I just wouldn't spend a whole lot of time and get too worried about it one way or the other. So I did mention in the written memorandum just a few other changes that I made that the group did not talk about. I won't go through each of these here, but I just wanted to point those out to you. They're all listed in bullet format in the memorandum. If you don't agree with that approach or that thought process, by all means, we can talk about that and we can adjust that. But I'm trying where possible to simplify things as much as I can. And honestly, my goal ultimately is to bring you a greatly simplified, complete overhaul of the UDO at some point in the future after I've got more experience here and more understanding of the community's values and, quite frankly, more time to do that. So, but I'm sort of chipping away at it as I go along if I can. So I just want to be completely transparent with you and with the public and with the Board of Commissioners about things that I've included in here that maybe we didn't talk about the last last time, and we can adjust as the group would like going forward. The only other thing I want to mention to you is when you look at the actual ordinance, just because of the way the chart's formatted, look for the little P to the side of some of the SUPs that are crossed out. I put the P in green. In many cases, the P fit nice and neatly underneath of the SUP that I crossed out, but in a couple places, there's not much room underneath of it. So you'll see a green P next to SUP. For example, if you look at bumper boats in the B20 category, what I'm recommending here, based on the group's discussion at the last meeting, is that we convert bumper boats from a special use permit to a permitted use. I didn't want you to miss the P there. If the P is there, it becomes a permitted use by right. If you don't see a P there, and some of them are like that, then that use is just deleted altogether from that zoning district. And I wanted to make sure you saw that, just because it would be easy to miss the little green P in some of these locations. Thank you.
And the P with the asterisk is no change from what it meant before, right?
That's correct.
Permitted with other.
Correct.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor for any discussion.
I was going to wait till last, but if nobody wants to go, I'll go first.
Yeah, please.
I am a little concerned that, although I understand the reason, that there is currently only one small parcel in town zoned B30, that I don't agree that it will be that way. And that I think we should consider that the B30 would be applied for, even for presently zoned residential property within the triangle. A couple of things that I just couldn't understand that were eliminated or not considered. For example, banks, savings and loans, mortgage companies, and other financial institutions. That does not show up at all in B10. It seems like B10 would be a reasonable place for a bank or a mortgage company and other financial institutions be.
Could I comment on
Yes,
that real
sir.
quick?
Thank you.
I think that's a great point. And personally, I would agree with you that banks would be appropriate in the B10 district.
Yeah.
But you have to go back to the task at hand,
Right.
which was to review the current special use permits
Right.
within the table of permitted uses. So
Right.
that would be the only reason that
Right.
maybe I didn't, or one of you didn't suggest that that should be permitted in B10.
Right.
Because that was not the assignment. Having
Yeah,
said that,
yeah.
it's completely reasonable thought. And if the board would like to add that as a permitted use in B10, we certainly can do that. So,
Well, I thought this might be the appropriate venue to raise issues like that. Okay, now, another thing I didn't understand on building materials and supplies. Well, the only place that it's allowed, according to this, is in the B30 district. Well, we happen to have 160,000 square foot building, materials and supply building, now in B20, the lowest home improvements. So what is the difference in building materials and supplies and on the next page, home improvement center, which is allowed in B20? See what I mean?
yeah, and again, I
Yeah.
generally would agree
Yeah.
with your thought process on that. In my mind, there's really no difference. And, perhaps we might consider just eliminating the building materials and supplies category altogether. That may be an approach you'd want to take. If you do that, you may want to include the B30 district as permitted for home improvement centers. And so the other thing I would just caution you and myself and everyone about is that there's not necessarily right or wrong answers to these questions.
Right.
And our current table of permitted and special uses is far from perfect.
Understand.
And I expect when you finish this process, it will still be far from perfect.
I understand. But it just seemed to me that they're the same thing.
I didn't see them the same.
No?
I don't either.
Building materials and supplies is, to me, right or wrong, was where you go into a yard where you see stacks of lumber outside and materials outside where, with big trucks delivering them, big trucks picking them up in big loads, whereas Lowe's Home Improvement, it's for the most part interior, inside.
Well, they have plenty outside.
Well, they do, but, like, a good
Building
example,
supplies, like what's the name of the place? in
Community
Cedar
lumber.
Point? No, in Cedar Point.
Safritz over by the fire
Safety, that's
station.
it, yeah, that to me is a, building supply where the people going in, it's really like a commercial kind of,
yes, that's what I'm saying.
it's not really.
Community lumber is another example where virtually all of the, except for tools and hardware, nails and stuff like that, it's virtually outside under shelters. Walston's used to be, well, Walston was kind of a combination because it was a pretty good hardware store also.
Right.
But that's the difference I see.
Well, to me, it's just an issue I wanted to raise. Now, some of these issues, these cabinet makers, well, that was decreed by the town board that was an allowed use in B20. And now it's eliminated except for B30.
Did that happen during the process when we were redoing the UDO?
No.
Just a lot of changes were made to here.
Previously.
So maybe
Well-
we need to look back and see when that changed.
Well, let me offer this comment. I'm speculating here, but I suspect that at one point it may have been a permitted
Yes,
use
it
in the
was.
B20, maybe even B30 also. And my theory is that when the UDO was drafted,
Yes.
administratively drafted, that change was
Yeah,
made and then it was
that's what I'm
ultimately
saying.
adopted.
Yeah.
I thought
Right.
that's what you were.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Summit did it. We didn't do it. This board.
But
did it.
ultimately you all approved it
Yes.
and the Board of Commissioners
Right.
approved it. But I suspect you may not have
Right.
recognized that.
But there are other issues. For example, driving ranges are listed as a special use permit. But it exists now in B20. So my question is, why leave it as an SUP and not just permit it?
I think that's appropriate because for a driving range, you really have to consider the area around it.
Yeah.
What the golf balls are going to hit.
I'm sorry.
What the golf balls are going to hit. So I think there's more to it than, I think there's more consideration for a driving range as far as location and what's around it rather than just permitted use.
So like, that's why you would want to have special use.
That's why
On that one.
special
So we
use
would actually
is
consider it
appropriate.
Yes.
Right.
neighborhood impact, whatever.
And if there's, is our driving range here, is that lit? Is the driving range here lit?
Yes,
So that's another thing, right? A consideration for, light discipline.
Like pollution.
Yeah.
but
Like
it exists and it's, okay. The other thing, when we have existing uses, for example, libraries and museums are allowed in B10, 20, and B30. But the only existing library in town happens to be in an R20 residential district. Now, how do we reconcile that?
I think that's actually a government lot, isn't it? I think isn't that blue?
Yeah.
It's blue, it's R20.
Well, So-
What's the one that's government?
So I can't remember the colors of which, but actually there's a common theme emerging here from all the comments, at least from the three of you to this point. And that is that ultimately there's an interpretation that is made by the UDO administrator, and then ultimately it goes through the process with the planning board and the board of commissioners. And I think you're always going to have that. Like, for example, on the home improvement centers and the building supply lots. If we eliminate one or the other, there's going to be an interpretation made by someone on that. on the driving range thing, it's important to note that we also have a category for family amusement centers, which are larger facilities that include the driving range. And so ultimately, there are those kind of interpretations that come into play. With regard to the library issue, is it a library or is it a local government use, including buildings, facilities, and parks? And so in that case, it's allowed in every zoning district. And again, our ordinance and no community's ordinance is perfect,
Gotcha.
and it's not going to be perfect. But so you have those kind of overlaps there. But I think it's great to have this conversation because maybe we should make some of those changes, or maybe you should tell me to go back and work on it some more, or whatever the board's pleasure is.
On the next page, or no, the same page as libraries, furniture manufacturing and woodworking. Well, you've struck through the exact ordinance when it was passed and where it was passed for B20. And now it's been struck through and only allowed in B30. I just wonder why.
No, it's still allowed as a special use permit in B20.
Right, but not a permitted use, which it was passed by the commissioners 7/9/2018.
Prior to Summit's
Yes,
review of it.
yes,
Yeah, and so,
yes,
so the other thing too is
yes.
where you see that crossed out, I'm just deleting all those
I know,
references
I know.
just because where would we stop
I
with
know,
that?
But it was
So,
very helpful for me to be able
Understood.
to specifically, I mean, believe me, I do my homework. And
It's obvious.
I'm trying to do a good job for the town and for future reasonable growth that's supported by our ordinances. Laboratories, well, I mean, my doctor's office, I'm sure, has a lab. So that's not allowed in a B20. My doctor's office is in a B20. So should we add that or?
yeah, and so again, for example, the office, we would probably interpret that as a doctor
Right.
or dentist, and we would permit that in the B20. But these are great points. And again, it's important to consider where you're starting from.
Right, right.
I realize the historical knowledge of what existed prior to Summit's work, but we're starting with what's in place as of today. And so that's why you see some of those things.
Right. Well, those are the majority of my observations, and whether or not they're valid or
I have a follow-up question on that. So as I think about doctor's offices, okay, that's permitted. But to my colleague's question about labs, if a physician wanted to come in and build a clinic, and the clinic happened to also include a lab, how would that be viewed?
Yeah, in my interpretation, we would consider that to be a doctor's office or a clinic or something like that.
Do we disregard the fact?
To me, the lab would sort of be an ancillary use associated with the doctor's office. And that's really where the interpretation comes into play. Now, if it's, a massive laboratory facility with one doctor in it, we might look at that a little bit different. And that also is a good point too. You probably saw in the draft ordinance amendment and in the memo there, I suggested some language about that interpretive aspect of the UDO administrator, and specifically removing the option for anything to be considered a special use permit in the future. But again, to underscore the point, it goes back to the interpretation of the UDO administrator, and hopefully that individual is going to make reasonable interpretations. In the example you gave, I would say that's a doctor's office, a clinic.
Just comment further on that. I distinguish that as laboratories, including science, research, testing. It could be like a GlaxoSmithKline, a big
Sure.
place with all kinds of chemical problems in the area. Virtually every doctor's office has a lab. Some of them are pretty small and don't do a lot, but they're right in the confines of a doctor's office, just a little room off to the side. So that's the way I looked at that when I saw the laboratories. I said, well, something like Burroughs Wellcome or GlaxoSmithKline could really be something you'd want an SCP for.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I think, the way I would interpret it. In this example, it's recommended to become a permitted use. But that would be an important distinction, I think. And again, I didn't touch on this in my verbal comments, but in the memo, for everyone's sake, please understand that even if you make it a permitted use, all of these uses still have to comply with various other requirements for height and setbacks and parking spaces and landscaping and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
So it's not a free for all if you change it from a special use permit to a permitted use.
And we don't want to make it difficult for doctors to open offices when we've already got a problem in town. You know, people moving into town can't find a doctor locally, they're going to Moorhead. So I don't think we want to make it too difficult. Anybody else have anything?
Yeah, I had a comment on this 8.22, determine the status of unlisted use. I found that paragraph quite difficult to understand. I understand, I think, what you want to do, but we're talking about things when people come up and want something that isn't in the table of permitted uses. And I'd like to take, it gives the UDO administrator some latitude to decide what it might be or what it's closest to. But if I want to take the example of the two SUPs that we did have, okay? One was a multifamily and a single family development, and the other was the expansion of something that wasn't permitted. And in both those cases, the UDO administrator was in favor of doing those things which weren't part of our ordinance. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about this 822 and
Sure.
how you see that it would be.
Yeah, great points. A couple thoughts. One is that this language was suggested by the town attorney. I talked with him about that, and I think he lifted it from another one of his clients. I think it came from Onslow County's ordinance, if I remember correctly.
Sounded like it.
And so, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was. But essentially and I think this is different than the special use permit example that you just referenced. Clearly, a multifamily residential use is not permitted in an R30 zone or really in any of our residential zones except for R10M. And so that's, I think, why they pursued the special use permit route. If you made the changes that we're talking about here tonight and someone comes in and they want to build multifamily residential units in the R30 zoning district, for example, they're going to be informed that that's not a permitted use. And your options really is only to request a rezoning of the property or a text amendment. That's a pretty straightforward, easy interpretation to make. And then as we've talked about, it then becomes a legislative process, which I personally prefer and think is less cumbersome for everyone involved, in my opinion and in my experience. But the language here, essentially what it says is, like a great example that Bruce just brought up about the lab and the clinic, in that particular case, the UDO administrator would review the overall project, what's proposed, the scale of it, what percentage of it is doctor's office, what percentage of it is GlaxoSmithKline, large manufacturing facility. And ultimately, what it says is the UDO administrator would make an interpretation. In that case, I would label it as a clinic or a doctor's office. We would assign the requirements associated with doctors and dentists in the table of permitted and special uses. If it's something that is just completely off the wall and not listed here and there's nothing even close to it, see if I can think of a good example off the top of my head. If there's something that's pretty darn close, like the whole doctor, clinic, laboratory thing, we'll assign it to the closest use that's listed here. If it's something that's just completely foreign and not included in here, the applicant would be advised to seek some sort of amendment to the table of permitted and special uses. And that would go through the legislative process with the planning board and the board of commissioners and so forth. And so that's what this says. And then finally, if let's say, for example, the applicant didn't agree with the UDO's administrator's interpretation, the final recourse is they can certainly appeal that interpretation to the Board of Adjustment. I would hope that wouldn't happen very long. I think actually in my entire career, I've probably only had a few Board of Adjustment meetings because we try to work it out before it gets to that point, either tell the person you can't do that or find some way to structure their project in a way that will work. But that's the ultimate. If the interpretation is disputed, it can be appealed to the Board of Adjustment. More likely, I would be directing the applicant to go through the legislative process, to come to the planning board and say, hey, what do you think about allowing this kind of use or with these kind of requirements, et cetera, kind of like we did with the R10M.
And then it has to
so-
pass the consistency test for the land use plan.
Correct,
So, which could kill it there.
potentially.
Right.
So, Frank, if it wasn't clear cut, okay, you know, off the wall is a good word. Would you bring it to this board or something, say, what do you think about this thing? Or would you just, you know?
Yeah, so ultimately, yes. I mean, if it's not clear cut and I made an interpretation that it was a particular permitted use here, you are still going to see that when it goes through the approval process, through the planning board, the site plan approval process, and ultimately the Board of Commissioners. That's your check on the staff, and then ultimately the Board of Commissioners check on you as the planning board and the staff going forward. So you're still going to see it, and you'll have an opportunity, I guess, to raise that question and bring that issue up. If I or whoever the UDO administrator is just simply says, hey, it's not allowed, you know, it's not a permitted use, chances are you're going to hear it because they're going to request some sort of amendment or clarification of our ordinance going forward. And then you would have to weigh in on that and say, is this appropriate or not appropriate? So I guess the short answer is I think you will hear about it. You're not going to hear about it maybe in the way that I think you're anticipating. I'm not going to come to you and say, gosh, I don't know what to do. What should I do in terms of the application of the ordinance for that particular request? But the process builds in, I think, that opportunity for you to be aware of that and to comment on it and gain the situational awareness and maybe adjust it later on.
You know, so there's a lot of standard that's going to have to be developed for all these permitted uses in the UDO, where it was special use and now we're it's being permitted by right. We're going to have to come up with some standards. How do you see us going about that schedule wise? What do you see that process?
Yeah, again, I don't, as I mentioned earlier, there are already so many requirements in the UDO that deal with height and parking and landscaping and setbacks and all of those kind of things that I think we will simply apply those standards to all of the uses that are listed as a permitted use in here. Now, as we go along, if there's a particular use that people are concerned about, we certainly can have a conversation about, well, should we require something more involved for that particular use? As I think I've shared with at least some of you in individual conversations, my overall approach, my philosophy about these things is at the end of the day, there's really only 5 or 6 things that really matter on every project. How tall is it? Does it have enough parking? What are the setbacks? Are they saving some vegetation or are they planting some new vegetation? Are they managing the stormwater appropriately? If you think about it, there's not really that much more that's really important, I think, in terms of how the project is going to look and function in a community. And I think all of us in local government sometimes have a tendency to get so wrapped up in every possible what if scenario that we come up with these really complex and cumbersome requirements, not because anybody has ill intentions, because they're just honestly they're trying to do their job as best they can. So I would submit to you, I'm being a little too wordy here, so I apologize. I'll try to tone it down. But I think we are. I don't think you have to come up with much more in the way of additional standards. I think they're already there, the ones that really matter, at least in 95% of the cases.
Well, what I'm thinking, the first thing that comes to mind for me is parking lots. You know, how much impervious surface. You know, the issues that we're having with that. So you feel like our standard is sufficient enough at this point to apply to all these?
Yeah, so for example, if you look at the table, the column on the left, there's a letter there for all these uses. That's the parking requirements and the parking category there. So whether or not those are the right requirements. Honestly, I haven't had enough experience here in Cape Carteret to know that, but somebody along the way came up with those standards and felt like they were appropriate. So I trust in that process, and they're there. I don't know that you would have to spend a lot of time saying, well, for example, we're changing mail order catalogs stores from a special use permit to a permitted use in the B20 zone. We ought to think about the additional parking requirements for that. I would look at the C, and I'd say, okay, we're going to require them to have whatever the prescribed number of parking spaces are there. So.
But we do have, but there is a lot of concern about stormwater and parking lots and in commercial area parking lots.
Yeah, and
Consideration.
And as I think I shared with the group collectively, and then maybe with some of you individually, that's one of the things on my to-do list is to develop some improved stormwater management requirements going forward. I'd like to spend a little more time thinking about that. The ordinance that we have right now is rather open-ended and difficult to apply. And I just want to make sure we get it right, because I can guarantee you it will have some degree of controversy attached with it, and that's why I haven't moved any quicker with it right now.
So we may end up going back at a later date once we've got the stormwater issue, once it gels a little bit better, then we may go back and make some adjustments on this. I think we should consider this a living document.
It is absolutely a living document. I mean, honestly, I think anytime you think an ordinance should be amended, you should amend it. I think they should be living, fluid documents based on the needs and the preferences in the community. But what I would submit to you is, when we look at the stormwater issue, I think we're going to look at that regardless of whether or not it's a mail order catalog store,
Right.
or a restaurant, or a gas station, or a doctor's office. So I think, and then the current stormwater ordinance, although I think we should and could do better, we would still apply that to all of these uses.
Okay.
Madam Chairman, if you'd allow a little levity.
Uh-huh.
This is our official Visitors Guide. And I wanted to share one of the uses that nobody in this room would contemplate.
Is it extra?
Yeah.
It's so
Yeah.
big right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, here's a full page ad on axe throwing. I don't think anybody in this room, including myself, is advocating that as a use, but that's an example.
Well,
If somebody were to come in and say, gee, I want to build an axe throwing place.
That's
right?
under family entertainment.
No.
Well, so ironically enough, I was literally in an axe throwing facility on Saturday night. Not here, but it's a part of a bar, and they have little. All it is it's a little stall setup. You know how, like, you've gone into a bar, they may have skee ball, or they may have the little pop-a-shot basketball game or whatever. It was basically akin to something like that. And if it was completely indoors as part of a bar, I don't know why we wouldn't allow that, and why we would have to regulate it anymore.
Alcohol, right?
Well, I guess, you may just not want bars or those kind of things, but I guess that's where I think I would challenge myself, and I would challenge all of us to really think about what the true impacts of the use are, because the impact of that use was the exact same impact as a restaurant or a nail salon on the community. I mean, they got a certain number of parking spaces. You want it to look like a nice building, those kinds of things. So, I didn't throw any axes because I didn't feel like spending the money, but.
But I just thought it was funny.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't ever. You amaze me.
But I would suggest to you, you would never know it was there. It might be in Mac Daddy's, for example. You might have it, but you wouldn't really know, and the impact would be the same as the arcade games or the bowling alley.
Sorry, I just thought it was funny.
That was great.
Oh, me.
Okay, anybody else?
Did we ever say what about the library in the R20 zone? Is it considered, just because it's owned by the community college and they lease a building, that it's a governmental? I don't think the community college is a governmental thing, is it? Or are we considering it a school?
Yeah, so, for example, looking at it now, I might be inclined to just simply put a line through the entire libraries and museums category, because they're always going to be governmental uses and they're permitted in every zoning district. So I've not run across any for-profit libraries. Maybe
Well,
there's,
I mean, I just wanted to bring it up.
yeah, no, it's a great point. I mean, and I think as we determined, there are a lot of examples like that in here. There's probably no harm in leaving it in there exactly as it's written, but if we want to tidy it up, I might suggest just deleting the category altogether, because the only for-profit museum I can think of is like Ripley's Believe It or Not or something like that. Otherwise, it's going to be a public
House's office is gonna
endeavor.
be a town museum at some point, and it's already zoned in 20,
Uh,
Whatever you wish, but
Yeah.
it just,
Sure.
it exists and it's in an R20 zone.
I would say that in that particular case, it would be considered a local government use and is therefore permitted in that zoning district.
For libraries, yes, but museums?
A public museum would be also, the way this is written.
Whatever the board's wish is.
Yeah, that library was kind of unique. And when they first put it up there, it was going to be also training classes and like, almost like a community college.
Well, the community college owns it.
Pardon?
The community college owns it.
Well, I understand that, but
Yeah, and they have
it wasn't
classes.
strictly a library. It had the other rooms for these classes, and I don't know how much they're doing there now, but in the beginning, there was quite a few classes that fill up that whole parking lot.
I wouldn't want to take out museums. I think that would be a wonderful addition to town. I'm kidding when I say that about homes,
Thank you.
but, a waterfowl museum, that kind of thing, something, specific to our, that would kind of highlight us on.
I think it's good because it calls it out specifically, and you don't have to make some kind of mental jump between a museum and a local government facility. It just says it's a museum. We don't have to go, oh, well, a museum is a local government facility. It's just a museum for whatever kind it is, whether it's publicly supported or privately funded. I like leaving it.
Yeah, me too.
We want to just put the word private in front of libraries and museums? Do you think there's any need for that? Or just leave it the way it is?
Well, that would clarify. Because then you've got the government piece down below it.
Got me thinking, is the Corsound Museum, is the Corsound Museum public or private?
Well,
Yeah,
I think it's a 501c3.
Yeah, I believe it's a nonprofit entity. And honestly, if we were presented with an opportunity for the Core Sound Waterfowl Museum or the Bogue Sound Waterfowl Museum to be here, I think we would make the interpretation that it's a local government facility and consider it under the local government uses. And again, that's where some of the interpretation comes into play, because you can't anticipate everything.
Anybody else?
Did we decide about banks?
I think B10 is fine. That makes sense. Making it permitted.
I think, in my mind, bank has a lot of people in and out, especially at lunchtime and after 4 o'clock on Fridays. But savings and loans, that's really kind of, but mortgage companies really aren't that different. An office, like an office. So I don't know if I want to see banks on any of our interior streets. I wouldn't have a problem with a mortgage company. I mean, how many people, the employees and,
The occasional customer.
yeah.
I'm looking for.
I refinanced my house, didn't leave my office.
Wow.
They just sent me the stuff.
Here, so take out
Oh,
banks and savings and loans and leave mortgage companies.
Well, I think if you look, like, for example, a mortgage company, for example, I would consider that to be a business and professional office.
Right, that's why I said that.
And so that's permitted in B10.
And maybe we should take mortgage company out of that, because now we've got a conflict.
Yeah, I think, anything like a movement mortgage office,
Right.
for
Yeah, that's
example,
what I'm talking
we're going to consider that as a business and professional office. And so, yeah, you may want to just delete everything except banks. in
Yeah.
that one category.
So leave banks, savings and loans, and take out mortgage and other financial institutions.
That assumes, of course, I think what Paxton was referring to is that maybe we should allow banks in the B10.
Yes. And why not the other things? It was just a question, because I don't consider them any more egregious in a B10 than,
Well, I think it's more commercial. There's a lot of going out, drive through. I just don't know that I want that on one of our side streets, like 2 or 3 lots in.
what side street?
Well, I need to look at that to see where we've got.
There's that. That would be the one big enough for it. These are
This is,
If I'm out of town and pay for this, that green one.
what's this?
That's the-
I guess the property that is next to yours had been B10 and was recently rezoned B20.
Correct, for a professional engineer's office.
Right. I don't know that we want, again, I don't know that we want that much traffic, that drive-through, it's because it's on an interior street, not on a main street.
Well, the
I don't-
town itself put an ATM on town property in that parking lot. And boy, that's drive-in. I mean, you drive in, you get out, go to the ATM and you drive out.
That property is actually on B20, where the ATM is, off of Manatee.
Oh, really? Oh, I see.
Yeah.
It's the piece on Dolphin that's green. I beg your pardon.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
just the town
yeah.
park
That's right.
behind us.
Right.
Oh,
The
So
other
what's
green
this?
is the church,
The
or First Citizens, excuse me.
First Citizens and part of the Easy Foods, what is it called now? Kangaroo or the gas station?
Yeah, which is interesting because it's zone B10 and that's where First Citizens is.
Well, that might be a mistake. That green on Manatee.
Well, I'm looking at the green between the
I
new
thought
four.
this was town hall. I thought this was police station, town hall, and the parking lot. That's what I thought.
Yeah, I think the green is. Sure.
Well, so the big green blob on the corner of Anita Ford is the First Citizens Bank
That's right.
next to the gas station.
That's right. But the green,
And green depicts B10.
That's Anita Ford.
That's
Yeah.
Anita
Oh, it
Ford
is.
right there.
Yeah.
Yes.
so there we go. We better,
Dolphins over here. And so where we're at currently, we're zoned B20, but the little grassy park behind us is zoned B10.
but look at the green on Dolphin behind the gas station. I think that's a mistake.
I think that's the little cut through road there and there's like a septic field, I presume.
But
in
it's
that little
owned
area
by
there.
the gas station.
Yeah,
I think it's a mistake. I just
Could-
never looked at that.
could be. I don't have the history that y'all do, but
I do. It was sold as a parcel, as one parcel. But even
We
more
can't,
reason.
we can't do anything about a drive-through that's already there. But just personally, I would rather not see drive-throughs off of our main street. These are residential neighborhood.
Where, that's only town property, right?
The green is B10.
Yeah.
The dark green is
But,
B10.
well, I still say the one was behind the station is a mistake. It was sold as a filling station years ago. I don't know how all of a sudden it got green there. But anyway.
You know, you've only got a handful of parcels that are B10. It is interesting that one of them is the bank. So,
Well, no,
so-
on this, on this map, we need to just research that a little bit.
Okay. So let's go back to what we want to do with the language. Do we want to make any changes to bank savings and loans and mortgage companies?
Yeah, strike from mortgage on.
So strike mortgage companies and other financial institutions, leave that permitted in B20 and B10, and consider mortgage companies, something like that, as a professional office, which is right now in B10. Okay, I think, does that sound good? Frank, did you-
if that's the board's pleasure, I think that's reasonable.
Anybody have any heartburn with that?
I'll abstain.
And that would not add the P for B10, right?
It would not.
Okay.
Frank, when there's a situation where, let's say the bank is in fact B10, what do? We just live with that because it's grandfathered in, or you
Yeah,
zone it?
yeah. So technically or
Yeah.
practically?
Yeah, both.
So I think technically it's just a non-conforming use within the B10 zoning district that should be subject to the non-conforming use provisions in the UDO. Practically speaking, if they came in and they wanted to do something different, unless it was truly offensive in the community, I'd probably suggest that they request a rezoning to
24.
B20.
Okay.
Practically speaking, I mean, I think ultimately we are trying to help applicants and property owners achieve their vision.
Right.
But in a way that is consistent with the overall vision for the town and maintain the integrity of the ordinance. But I'm always trying to get people to somewhere where they can accomplish what they want to accomplish within the integrity of the ordinances.
Okay, what do we want to do about building trades, contractor shops, and yards? Did we decide?
We just decided to leave it as is, right? Or are we talking about the one below it, or the building materials
No,
and supplies?
So
We're thinking about
Paxton,
adding it to B20 as a permitted use. That was what the question was.
Didn't this come up when Ken Hudson put his office and all that property? And didn't you bring up the fact that storage was required to be 30? And remember when you
oh, the
questioned
electrician?
that? No, the plumber
Oh, plumber.
and storage.
Yeah.
Now that's B20, as far as I can tell. So, but it's his contractor shop, office, and storage.
But he wasn't selling out of there. It was his own,
Storage.
it was storage for his own, it was his inventory.
Right. So why not permit it in B20?
Well, it's built, this would be building materials and supplies sales.
No, the one building trades, contractor shops and yards. Wouldn't that? fit the
Oh, I'm
def-
sorry, I thought we were talking about I thought you mentioned the one above it, building materials and supplies.
Well, I did question that,
Okay.
but then it dawned
Okay.
on me that we've got a B20 here that
Building trades and contractor shops, I mean, don't we have a cabinet shop right next to your building?
used to, but he moved out and somebody else moved in. But that's why I question why we didn't still have cabinet shop as a permitted use in B20, because it went through I've lost the word, Frank, zoning, a text change to allow that. And then Summit, for some reason, took it out or put it as a special use.
Yeah.
The only one I think maybe wouldn't fit that very well would be yards. I mean, building trades and contractor shops are really done well nicely these days, but like y'all were saying, if it's a yard where there's lumber and
Yeah.
things, people don't want that necessarily in B20.
Well, I wouldn't have a heartburn about striking the yards part and
Okay.
leaving the other.
Or we could add yards to the one above it if we don't put that one in B20.
Oh, it's fine in B30. Right now, that's in B30.
Right.
Mhm.
So I don't see where there's a problem with that. Building materials and supplies,
I would hate for somebody to be considered a non-conforming use as a result of this discussion.
You mean an existing business?
Yes, sir.
And what are the ramifications if they find themselves, whoa? in a non-conforming use?
Well, for example, if their storage building burnt down, they couldn't build it back.
oh, you can within 6 months if it's the same use.
I didn't see that.
Yeah.
I missed that. Thank you.
Yeah, they cannot expand the degree of
Thank you.
nonconformity
I
going
missed
that.
forward, but they should be
that was
able
my
to
example.
replace it if it's unfortunate event like a fire or something like that. So
Is there a percentage or, I mean, what if the bank burned down?
typically, it's 50%. I'm trying to find the
So
specific language in here right
don't take
now.
up the time. I'm so
Okay,
sorry. I missed that.
No, but I think that the general point is one that you all should consider. Do you want to knowingly make someone a non-conforming use? If it's a use that you think is really offensive in the community right now, you may want to do that. But generally speaking, you probably don't want to do that, would be my guess.
Do we have anything in town that we don't like?
Well, according to a great
I can
deal of
think of some
discussion, the condominiums.
Oh, I'm not in
They're
favor.
they're non-conforming use.
No, I'm talking, I think what I'm really talking about is commercial. Is there anything that we really find offensive that is here that, I can't think of anything.
Yeah, I,
Oh, the storage.
Storage.
Again, don't get me started on that.
I think everybody.
I'm with you.
But what to do?
So are there
Let's
any
move
changes?
yards.
Are there any changes to those two categories?
What if we move yards up to building materials, supplies, and yards, right? That makes sense to me.
Mhm.
And then building trades and contractor shops gets permitted in B20.
Oh, I think that's a good idea.
Yay.
Well done.
So add yards after building materials and supply.
Right, exactly.
Supply yards, yes, absolutely. And then building trades, contractor, and
Which usually
contractor
goes
shops
Good.
Yeah,
permitted in B20.
And could we add the word storage?
To what?
Building trades, contractor shops with storage?
Well, I think you have to be, I think, yeah, it's implied that if you're
Okay.
building something,
All right.
you have to have some kind of inventory.
well, I'll use my friend Tyler as an example. He has the coastline homes, but they do store the pools over there. I don't know if that would be permitted, but it's like his office is really nice.
Where is that?
It's in Vogue, right before Vogue Loop on the left.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
that
Oh, yeah.
Craftsman house they redid.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's really nice office.
Yeah.
And cabinet makers, are we leaving that in 30 or would that really fall under building trades and contractor shops anyway? So we really, could we strike cabinet makers because it falls into building trades and contractor shops?
I would say so. It's pretty clear.
I would give it to B20.
Okay. So we strike cabinet makers, but it would be interpreted as a building trades contractor
Yeah.
shop.
Mhm.
Gotcha.
It works.
And for veterinary offices and ancillary uses, we're considering the boarding as an ancillary use, right?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Veterinary offices and their ancillary uses, we're considering boarding as an ancillary use.
Let me,
Because
I think the boarding,
that was stricken.
no, the animal hospital was stricken because I
Without-
viewed that as the
without
same
door
thing as a
pens.
veterinary office.
Well, the animal hospital with outdoor pens, that's what I'm thinking. That's why are we,
But I think there's an alternative, there's dog training facility here. That's an SUP. I believe there's another dog category if I'm not mistaken.
I thought there was a boarding.
That's what
it was, boarding was under animal hospitals with outdoor pens. Oh, no, boarding.
no, there's a category pet daycare and boarding facility.
Oh,
So that's separate. So the reason I struck the animal hospital is I thought it was the same thing as a veterinary office.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to simplify it. But the pet daycare and boarding facilities, which I would say a dog boarding facility would still require a special use permit.
But don't we have one now that's under construction, almost finished?
Yes, and it's a boarding facility. That's why I'm
Yeah.
asking.
So why shouldn't it be permitted in B20?
I think
It
that,
is a
I
B20 right
think
now.
that's a little safer with an SUP. Because,
That could get out of hand.
yes, exactly.
yeah, I think, my general thought on this in a very broad sense is that if it's an indoor type use and with really no impact on anyone outside, it probably makes sense to make it a permitted use. If it's something that might have a significant outdoor component that potentially impacts neighbors, then maybe that's more appropriate for a special use permit, i.e. a dog boarding facility or maybe a driving range or something like that. So that was my thought process. Kind of like the axe throwing thing. It's inside a bar. I don't care. Honestly, I don't care what you do inside any building, as long as you don't bother anybody else, right? Like, what do I care if you're throwing axes or playing with a dog in the building, as long as it looks nice and as long as you have enough parking and you control your stormwater
It's
and.
the outdoor pens that I kind of object to because of the noise issue. I mean, if it's only.
And I think that's covered
20
with,
feet,
the way this is written, that covers that concern.
Is there an outdoor component for Michelle? Michelle Cox's?
Yeah.
The new building, there's
Yes.
outdoor.
I believe so. I believe they have outdoor kennels.
Yeah, and so the way this is written, I don't know what the approval process was for that. I obviously wasn't here, but the way this is written, if that project was proposed today and someone proposed that, and if it had that outdoor dog kennel facility, I would suggest it would go through a special use permit process. If it was just the veterinary hospital and didn't have a boarding component and all the dogs are staying inside, then it would be a permitted use under the veterinary office application.
Oh, I forgot to turn mine. But all the important people are here with me.
Luckily, there isn't by any residential areas.
All right.
No, but you do have to consider other businesses. If any of those businesses across the street wanted to have outside dining and they had outside dining in the rear, right? Like, it would be dogs barking and it would be stinky. So kind of, you just kind of have to think about the other businesses and the.
To
I'm a dog
be
lover.
sure they're enlightened enough, in my own, I've had 2 dog kennels and 2 residences. And in each one, I had a septic tank attached to my kennel. And every day I would wash it down and it would go into a little distribution box is what it was, and a drain field. And there was never the first fly or odor or anything. Now, to be sure, the vet would have thought of that. The
Well,
board,
we'd make sure of that with a special use permit.
I got you.
Right.
I got you. I mean,
Make a note.
yeah, yeah. 3 kennels I had.
And I think there's a difference between like 1 or 2 beagles and, you know, like 20
Great Danes.
barking dogs that are missing their mommies and daddies. Okay, any other changes? Did you get everything?
All right, let me go through what what changes would be made to this document, just to make sure I've got it correctly. So I'm on, I should start numbering these pages, but I'm on the first page, and under the very last use, banks, savings, and loans, the phrase mortgage companies and other financial institutions would be deleted.
Yes.
On the second page, the second use, building materials and supplies, the phrase "and yards" would be added. Under the next one,
Oh, excuse me, but is it going to be permitted under B20?
No.
Only
That's-
under B30?
Yes, for the yard.
for the yard.
That's the next one.
Oh,
And-
excuse
yeah,
me.
the next one, building trades, contractor shops, the phrase "and yards" would be deleted, but it would be a permitted use in the B20 zoning district. The cabinet makers category would be deleted altogether. The thought being that it would be considered a building trade. The maybe the only other change, that's all that I wrote in my notes. If I missed something, please let me know that.
Were we gonna take out libraries, leave museums?
I think are we gonna put the word private in libraries and museums? Or just leave it libraries and museums?
I would just suggest keeping it libraries and museums. That would be my thought for you. In reality, most likely it'll be a government facility. We would process it as a government use.
So the Lego museum, you don't think would be a government?
I don't think so, but you'd probably make a lot of kids happy if you.
Right. That'll put us on the map.
So I didn't have any other changes. I guess one question for you. Whether or not the language is correct, are you all comfortable with the concept outlined in new section 8.22?
I could write it better than that.
Okay.
But I understand that Elijah wrote it.
But are you comfortable with the overall concept that A, we're not going to allow something that's not listed to be processed as a special use permit? B, ultimately the UDO administrator is going to assign it to the closest category. That makes sense. And C, if that's not possible, they either need to request a rezoning change or a text amendment, or they could appeal it to the Board of Adjustment. That's the basic gist of it.
Yeah, I was fine with it.
Sounds
When you
good.
sign it to the closest area, that's a judgment on your part.
Absolutely.
And I would, it's a perfect example, this meeting right here tonight. We got into the weeds on this stuff, okay?
Yeah.
And those things, you make a judgment like that, I'm not so sure that I wouldn't want a planning board to look at that,
So if the planning board is just advised, right, just advised, and we believed that it needed review so that we could we felt that we needed a deeper review to advise
Yes.
the Board of Commissioners, then I think that's something we can do as the way that we work between the office, the planning board, and the Board of Commissioners. So that when the planning board says to the Board of Commissioners, on a brief, hey, this is coming up, we think it needs a little bit of a deeper dive, could you task us? And then let them make a recommendation from there.
Yeah.
Because if they don't want to task us, they're not going to listen to our recommendation, even if it went through this anyway.
Here,
Well,
here.
That's right, but sometimes I think having 6 people appointed to the board that are citizens of the town, kicking this around is a good thing, okay? Because you bring stuff up, issues come up that wouldn't otherwise come up. And, all these little what ifs and stuff that come up in these meetings, I think that it's good for the process. And I just didn't want, like, for example, you're going to assign it a category that's closest in your opinion. I'm not sure, I feel comfortable that because looks like we would get some kind of a review process of it. But prior to that, we didn't. We had recommendations from this board that were brought before the commissioners differently, So.
Well, what I would submit to you is whether it's on this issue or any issue really, but you need to hold me and the staff accountable. I mean, if we're making interpretations that you think are questionable, you need to let me know that. And perhaps we need to adjust. And ultimately, if I am making a bunch of interpretations that don't make any sense, the Board of Commissioners should take some sort of action to rectify that with me, or ask me to deal with that with the staff, or if I'm a complete idiot, get rid of me. So,
I guess I'll put it really blunt.
so you need to hold me accountable. I mean,
Yes.
and make sure that, and if at some point in time, you're like, gosh, what in the world is this guy thinking? We need to talk about it.
Here's the review process I like about the planning board involved. If I was a contractor coming into the town and I wanted to do something that I read the ordinance and I didn't think I could get away with, if I'm just dealing with you, it's only one person. When you deal with a planning board, it's 6. And that's why the planning board is so healthy in having a say in the process, even though it's only advisory. We raise questions, we bring things up. You get a lot more questions answered in this than you do at a Board of Commissioners meeting, where essentially it's presented to you and you vote. That's kind of.
I think we are well on our way to establishing communication and trust among those 3 entities. And,
Yeah.
and I think we just got to keep plugging along, and make sure we don't go backwards to where we were before. That resulted in,
Let me take a stab at this question. So process-wise, a request comes to you, it doesn't quite fit in, you exercise your judgment. You assign it to the next closest category. Would we automatically be privy to that
Yeah, so
before it's finalized?
so my intent is that any commercial site plan that we review, my intent is to first review it at the staff level, and hopefully make sure that they've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and that it complies with all of the various requirements. And then bring it to the planning board and say, here's the proposal for a new veterinarian office, for example. We've reviewed it, it's a permitted use, they got enough parking, they got a good stormwater plan, blah, 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 blah. It's 20 feet tall, whatever the case is. And you all would review that then. And if for whatever reason at that point in the discussion, you felt like I or the staff made the wrong interpretation, I would expect that you would voice that at that time. And we would talk about that. And hopefully we would explain it to you and you'd say, yeah, that makes sense. Or you might say, gosh, I think you got it wrong. And we don't recommend approval of this.
Yeah, so you really expanded my question. You're suggesting that every matter is brought before us, not just the ones that you're assigning the next closest one to.
Well, I am suggesting that everyone comes to you, and I will admit to you that our UDO is a little bit confusing with regard to that particular question. And what I would submit to you is that I want you to be looking at, here's what my hope and my expectation is. I hope that you ultimately do gain trust in the staff to do a thorough review and to identify the issues. Hopefully we've worked with the applicant and we've made it easy for you. Hopefully everything complies. They've met all the requirements. And what I hope will happen is that we bring you a plan that someone submitted, and if it complies with every requirement that we have, I hope honestly it becomes a rubber stamp at that point in time, because the applicant has basically lived up to their end of the bargain. They complied with everything. If you believe that they haven't, or if you believe the staff hasn't been thorough enough in the review, I want you to point that out. And I want us to talk about that. And if you think that interpretation is wrong, so forth. And even if it's a rubber stamp situation, to me, that's a success. I know that's a bad word for a lot of people, but to me, that's a success because that means everybody did their job correctly. And I want you to at least just be aware of it so that as the planning board, you can think about, you're aware of the issues and what's happening. You can think about whatever ordinance change you might want to make in the future. So
I
recommend.
have a follow-up question to this. So if that's the process that we would follow, there would be no commercial development that would take place in this community prior to us being well informed.
We need that situational awareness.
That is my goal. Now, that's not, I don't know that that's as clear as it could be in the UDO right now. And certainly if it's a minor type thing, like somebody's putting a small addition on their office building, I don't expect to bring things like that to you. But if somebody's building a new veterinarian office and it's permitted use, then yeah, my expectation is to bring that to you and then ultimately on to the Board of Commissioners and say, yeah, it looks great or it doesn't. Because I think it's important for you to know what the issues are, what's going on, what works in our ordinances or maybe what doesn't. But I also want you to be fair to the applicant. If they've dotted all the i's and crossed all the t's, I hope that you're not going to sit there and nitpick them to death and try to add on other things because that gets frustrating for any applicant and would for you if you were the applicant, I think.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you got right on. You're right on it. I'll give you a real simple example of what I didn't want to see happen. When I bought my house here, I had a little section of it zoned commercial, okay? Now, it was probably zoned incorrectly anyway, because if that wasn't spot zoning, and the R20 was spot zoning. And then when I came in to buy the property, I asked the town, this is zoned commercial. It was a fish house, okay, on my property. And Clark says, don't worry about it. And I said, well, I'm not worried about it. I'm not planning to put in a fish house, but it was rezoned without any input from me at all.
While you owned it?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
So those are the kinds of things that I think having six eyes, six people that belong in the community and live here, reviewing it is the healthiest thing we're ever going to get in the world, for a town.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a bad example, but it's a real one.
Let me tell you why I think it's important that we have situational awareness. Because, and I'll use the new veterinary hospital as an example. There's all that commercial property up and down Gulf and Dolphin, right? That could be developed or redeveloped or whatever. Had we thought about that, or whoever did it when those plans came in, we would have recommended probably that building be oriented so that the front faced Gulf and Dolphin Drive, right? Now it's on the side. So those are the kind of things that, had we thought ahead, had we had a little bit of situational awareness and maybe considered what the future planning was, those are the little things we would have made recommendations for. So that, in other words, once that area was all developed, that it would almost be like our little main street.
Yeah. So I want to be clear with you because I don't want to mislead you or anyone in any way. First, I want to understand that the building that's being constructed right now, that's a veterinary office. My assumption was that it was facing Gulf and Dolphin Drive, is it not?
No,
I think it is.
the front faces.
Well, that's open to interpretation, but I think it looks fine.
Well, anyway, and I guess that's an important distinction because my perception, and I have not looked at it terribly closely, but my perception is that it is fronting on Gulf and Dolphin Drive. But be that as it may, I don't know that if that project came through and they met all of the requirements that we've outlined here, and you were not comfortable with whether they chose to make the front on Gulf and Dolphin Drive or on the side road there, which I don't even know that it's not really a road. Right. I think they would. My point is, I guess, and I want to be clear with this, I don't think that you would have the opportunity to require them to change what you think the front should be. in this particular situation. If they've complied with all the other requirements, you certainly have the right to talk with the applicant and to make the suggestion, say like, hey, could you possibly do this? And 9 times out of 10, people are going to try to do what you want anyway.
Right.
And if it's something really crazy, they're probably not going to. But so I don't want to mislead you in any way. I want to get to a system, and I think it works better for all parties concerned with a system where we're clear about what's required. And if they meet it, great, you're good to go. Hope your project's wonderful and successful.
I just, as we go forward and there's development in any of these areas, I just want to make sure that it's not hodgepodge. That we have an idea of what we want it to eventually look like when it's done, and that's the picture we kind of move towards.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's important for you to review these things and be familiar with it. And like, so in that particular case, I mean, just as a technicality, the driveway that's kind of behind what used to be the coffee shop, it's now the Pet Sense or whatever, that's not a road.
No.
And
It's a
so,
service alley.
so I would think that by default, the front would be fronting Dolphin.
Yeah, but I think
Anyway.
right now it's not, that the front doors are on the alley. But I'll go back and look at it. I think it just looks funny to me.
Okay, at any rate, I mean, but I think, those are the kind of things. And I think if we're building trusting cooperative relationships with applicants, those are the kinds of things where you can probably figure it out. with people.
Because then what you've got is you've got a parking lot. You might have all these nice buildings that looks like a little main street. And then in this one big area, you've got nothing but parking lot instead of the other front of the building and landscaping, and who wants to drive by them? Parking lots are ugly. There's not a lot you can do with them.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I would like to see, avoided, so that we would have a nice.
Well, the individuals, the property owners, they buy a property, they want to put something on it, but they don't have the vision for the town. And I think
Right,
that's
that's
what you're
what
talking
we have
about.
to have.
They might orient something or be doing something, putting a buffer in where that doesn't comply with what the
Right.
direction of the town has decided that they want to go.
But I think what I'm hearing Frank say is, assuming the applicant meets all the requirements, we can suggest certain things based on our vision of future development.
Yeah.
But it's precatory. We can't force them to do it. It's our wish, and it's up to them to comply or not.
But I would like to see us have
That input.
that input so that we can.
Yeah. And as Frank is suggesting, at least I'm hearing, 9 times out of 10, a developer will try to work with you.
Yeah.
But if they're operating in a vacuum, they don't know what they're trying to.
I mean, we talk about in the ordinances here, we talk about the side, we talk about the rear, we talk about the front. That means something. You have to say, okay, this is the front of your property.
Right,
You can't be 25 feet off when you're supposed to be 30 feet off.
right. But I think that wasn't done there. Well, that's, again, I'm going to have to go back and walk around that property. It just looks to me, maybe it's the way that.
But even so,
parking
who's
lot
to
is
say what the
oriented.
front is or what the back is or what the side is of a building? It's rectangular. If a door is on the side, does that mean that's the front? Or does that mean that's the side? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You-
that's right.
What you're saying, you can put the side on what the front is by definition, okay, in the ordinance, not what the building looks like.
Correct.
I'm just more concerned when we're talking about setbacks.
Yeah.
Buffers.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing, and the parking lot.
If we say, if there has to be a vegetative buffer on the side and they orient that along the street, we would say, hold on, that's the front. We're
Right.
talking about the side over here.
Right.
And they would say, oh, okay, I get that.
Right.
They're probably not wanting to do something crazy. They just think about it the way they think about it. It's their property. They're like, oh, I'll think about it this way. They don't have the vision of the town in mind.
I'm ignorant when it comes to the specific plans for that veterinary office, but I would imagine that the front setback was applied off of Golf and Dolphin Drive. That seems logical, and that would be considered to be the front. But I could be wrong. But I think it's a great conversation, because here's maybe the key point. So you made the comment that you really don't want to see big parking lots in the front, right? And so that may be completely appropriate in typical commercial zoning districts. But for example, if you're trying to create a town center concept, for example, you may have a very specific standard that says the parking lot's got to be in the back,
Right.
for example. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we need to figure out as a community what
Right.
we want, and we need to put that in the ordinance
Right.
and so that you get what the community's vision is.
Exactly.
And I promise we'll get started on the town center sometime soon.
Because I want to take this break to go from Starbucks to Macbeth. Okay, we good? Okay, our next meeting, Frank,
Well, I think, yeah, what I would ask you all is to, with the changes that we summarized, someone to make a motion to recommend adoption of the ordinance to the Board of Commissioners, if you're so inclined.
okay, are we ready to do that, folks, or do we want to wait until we see it in print, or is everybody good for that now?
I'm good with it.
Okay, Neil, you want to make that motion
I'll
then?
make the motion.
Sarah, you want to second it? All in favor? Already got it? Paxton is, Paxton is abstaining.
Yes, he said yes, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Paxton, and you know that any changes to the UDO, you vote on as the ETJ.
Yes.
You do that, okay. Next meeting is November 15th. Let's take a look at the, and see what that looks like.
That is the evening right after, the very next evening after the Board of Commissioners meeting. So it may be a relatively light agenda just because of the workload involved with preparing for the Board of Commissioners, but
Is it worth moving it? But then if we move it, that would be Thanksgiving week.
yeah, at the moment, I don't know for certain. I think there's a strong possibility that you'll get a rezoning request for the Taylor Notion Road property that was the subject of the townhouses.
Okay.
If that comes through, that may be the only item on the agenda at this point in time.
Is that all that you would expect us to see at that point, is just a rezoning request?
If it even comes,
Okay.
yes. So the group had considered requesting it for this agenda. Ultimately, they decided not to. I think some of them are out of town, so it probably will come up at your, I think it'll come up November 15th.
Susan, I got two items. They don't necessarily have to be at this next meeting.
Can you wait until, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, let's,
Because our comments are number 6. I wanted to make sure we're getting past, I'm just trying to stay with the agenda. Can you wait until?
well, I can wait, sure, but these are items for the agenda, for discussion.
For next time. Is that what you're saying?
For the next planning board meeting?
Or next one or the next one after that.
You can,
Yeah.
whatever you prefer, we
Go
can
ahead.
talk about
Okay.
whatever. So.
First one, this is discussion, establishing impervious coverage throughout the town. Right now, CAMA governs within 575 of the waterways, and that's a 20% impervious surface, or 25%. And I'm just having a discussion whether we ought to include that with the stormwater issues we have in other parts of the town. And the second item is, Frank, I welcome your comment on this. I'd like to have a discussion about the planning board getting review of SUPs like other towns have done. And I understand that is something that can come from the Board of Commissioners.
Oh, we just heard about that.
What?
I think we discussed that last time where it's not legally possible.
Well, they do it in other.
Well, there's two things.
You can have the Board of Commissioners, ask them.
Like a
to
point.
review it. Yes.
Well, so let me clarify what the previous comment was. If the Board of Commissioners, if the governing body is the ultimate approval authority for a special use permit, I don't believe it's legal, and I certainly don't think it's wise or appropriate to have any other body reviewing that, whether it's a planning board or anybody else, but in this case, it's a planning board. Because it just, the whole nature of the special use permit process, it's a quasi judicial process. The decision is supposed to be made solely based on the evidence presented at that meeting. And the commissioners, the governing body members, they're not allowed to even have any conversations about it with the applicant or with citizens prior to that meeting. And so when you introduce the planning board into that, I personally don't believe it's legal. Even if you could argue it was legal, I would suggest to you it kind of undermines the intent of the quasi judicial process. Hold on. So just because I want to get out the second thought and because I think of what you're dealing with, I wanted to just restate that was my explanation to you all at a previous planning board meeting. Could the Board of Commissioners, as a matter of a legislative decision, could they delegate review and approval of special use permits to the planning board? They absolutely could. They could delegate it to the Board of Adjustment and they could take themselves out of the process completely if that were the case. That's an option, and that's probably what you're seeing in some other communities.
That's the research, that's how it was done.
That's right.
And I want to have that discussion with this group.
But what, just to follow up to that
Yeah.
point, that becomes the end of it.
Right.
That's right. Your decision would be binding. You would have much greater authority. And so some governing bodies are reluctant to cede that authority and delegate that. Some like that.
That's the research that I did on that, Frank, that the process, you said it could be delegated to the planning board. But they also, the research that I did, the evidentiary hearing was run by the Board of Commissioners. So I don't know that they were totally out of, maybe there's something I didn't understand.
Wait a second, can't the Board of, I keep pointing over there. Can't the Board of Commissioners maintain their authority to approve or disapprove, but during their review process, task the planning board to do our own review and make a recommendation, or at least comment?
I thought that's what we just discussed.
That's what Frank just said. He said we can't do
But
that.
not for, no,
Yeah,
no,
because,
this would be that, I'm talking about it goes to them first.
right, but then
And then they
but
test.
they have to make that decision in that session.
No, they don't. They have 60 days to review it.
It's an interesting angle.
They
They
get a
have to
60-day
review it.
review
But they're not even allowed to talk amongst themselves. Wow, how could they?
before the evidentiary hearing.
Hmm.
So they have the evidentiary hearing at the Board of Commissioners.
Mhm.
And the Board of Commissioners can or cannot, but they have the option during their review process to task the planning board
Gotcha.
to make a recommendation, to kind of get in the weeds,
Mhm.
make a recommendation to them about, how that may fit into, some other things. And then that goes back. I mean,
That's why we need to discuss it. We're right
Yeah, I
here.
guess
we're
you're starting the
getting into it
discussion
now.
right now. I'd be happy to have the town attorney opine on it and comment further on it. I personally don't believe it's legal. If there is an angle that makes it legal or an interpretation that makes it legal, I still would submit to you, I don't think it's wise or fair, but I'm just sharing with you my opinion. Obviously,
Who's it not
you
fair?
will.
The applicant.
I don't think it's really fair to all parties concerned because the nature of the process is that it is a quasi judicial hearing. The decision technically should be made based on the evidence presented at that meeting. And so if you start interjecting other groups, you're inherently politicizing, and I don't mean politicizing in a bad way, but you're inherently politicizing that issue, which is why I just prefer the legislative approach in general, because talk to whoever you want, make whatever decision you think is right, gather whatever information you have. But I'll be happy to talk with them about it.
So
And again,
what
it's okay
should
if you
be
don't agree with
happening-
my thoughts. I'm just sharing them with you. So
what should be happening during that 60-day review?
I think the 60-day review period is just to provide some certainty for the applicant in there. And it may be appropriate to approve it or deny it right on the spot. It may be appropriate to task additional research, or that just maybe they want more time to think about it or consider it. It depends on, I guess, what you want to accomplish with it. But I would be my recommendation to you would be to be very thoughtful about that. And again, I think it depends on what your philosophy is. I mean, my philosophy and my approach to things, obviously, I'm going to take my direction from the governing body and to some extent from the planning board. But my overall philosophy is I want to provide as much certainty as I can for the applicant, for the neighbor, for the planning board, for the board of commissioners, for the staff, so that people know what they need to do. And it's a smooth, easy, efficient process for people, ultimately because I think that builds a better community. And it builds more cohesion in the community. And you heard me say this at the very first meeting. My ultimate goal is I want people to enjoy their lives and get along. And so I'm trying to, and I know that sounds hokey, but just know that in everything I do, I've got that thought kind of underpinning what I'm doing to try to ultimately get to this.
Yeah. So right now, the planning board provides the Board of Commissioners with a statement of consistency. When does that, so we would be reviewing something if the letter of consistency would go to the Board of Commissioners at the evidentiary review or somewhere during that 60 days.
Yeah, so that's really what got us to the point of considering this ordinance amendment tonight. I don't think our UDO is legal in that sense. I had an interesting conversation with a professor at the Institute of Government exploring that question. And as you might imagine with the law, there are good arguments on either side for that. So,
That's what it says in the 160D.
it also says in the 160D, it's a quasi judicial hearing. You make your decision based on the evidence presented at the hearing, and you shouldn't be affected by other people's thoughts and comments during that process. So I'm not trying to be argumentative with you. I'm just trying to illustrate for you that it's not as cut and dry, to the point where I had this same circular conversation with the attorney professor at the Institute of Government. So it's not just you and me, it's
So
the experts
what
too.
I'm trying to understand is, I feel like our job is to advise the Board of Commissioners so that they have all the information, including ours, all the information they need to make a decision. How can we help them? What can the planning board do to help the commissioners make their decision?
Yeah,
We'll have to ask them.
well, from my standpoint, I think.
Or they don't need our help?
I think, I think they absolutely do, and they absolutely value that. And I think you're doing that when you're making recommendations on amendments to the R10M zoning ordinance, when you're preparing a comprehensive land use plan, when you're making recommendations on amending the ordinance of table of permitted and special uses, and whatever else, impervious coverage or stormwater, whatever else we may talk about going forward. So, those are the important things. And so, and like I said, my intent is to bring you commercial projects. What I hope you won't do is start adding things on that aren't required, but I hope that that will give you a sense of maybe what new ordinances we should come up with, or maybe what ordinances we should throw out or relax in some way.
One of the things I think we need to consider is we're forming a relationship with the town staff and the Board of Commissioners based on our work. And that hopefully is growing and making everyone increasing trust amongst all those groups. This board's going to change at some point, and I think we need to take into consideration that it's not just our relationship and how we work together, but it's setting in place the rules and regulations and the processes that are going to take place after we're gone, and so that someone else can follow up with that, even if there isn't the level of trust that we establish. If there's a problem in the future, we want to try to help that process by making the process right, not just by basing it on our relationships.
None of us may be here tomorrow.
That's right.
This is Madam Chair, I think it needs to be on the agenda. We're wearing it out, and I didn't mean to have this discussion tonight. No.
You started it.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
I'm hoping for a
Okay,
short meeting.
so then I think it is good to have it on the agenda, because maybe either this meeting or the next, when you could run this to ground about, is it legal, is it not, does it need to be taken out of the UDO? Because if we want to stay legal and not make the recommendation, then we're not compliant with our UDO. You know what I mean? Like, at this point,
Understood.
let's just.
And the reason I bring it up, Frank, is in the last 6 or 8 months, there's been several of planning boards in neighboring towns that are doing just reviewing SUPs and making recommendations. And that's why I researched it and said it could be delegated to the planning board. So let's cut this discussion tonight so we can get home and watch this baseball game that's coming on.
Did the
And,
Yankees win? Well, so again, just to be crystal clear with you, it is absolutely legal for the Board of Commissioners to delegate the final approval authority for special use permits to the planning board or to the Board of Adjustment. That's not in question here.
Well-
The question is, basically, you can have one group or the other, but in my opinion, you can't have
You can't
both.
have
Well, it sounded like from the things I saw in the paper it was both, but I don't have enough,
Understood.
I don't know if I'm right on that, so.
You might have a lot of little towns who are doing things illegally or
Well,
improperly.
I'm sure.
So.
Sure.
That's why I
you know,
wanted
Since
to.
they don't
Yeah.
know.
Well, we don't have a budget, but could we request perhaps that the town attorney be at the next meeting that this is going to be under discussion to advise us?
Here's, we could certainly have him involved in it, and I will absolutely do that anyway. But what I would say to you is, if we could have this discussion maybe in December, that would help
That'd be
me,
fine.
if that's
That's fine.
okay.
I'm not
Just
in a
because
rush
of the
on this, I
timing
just
of
want-
things.
That's great. So there were the two things was a review of the SUPs and impervious surface coverage at some point.
Understood.
So, but it won't be Tuesday, November 15th, is that right?
I don't, we're going to have a meeting on
Right,
November 15th,
right,
but I
right.
would not, those are meaty issues.
Right.
I would not expect either of those to be on that agenda, but we'll get them on sometime.
That's fine.
So that's,
Okay, we ready to move on to town manager comments? Frank, you got anything?
I don't have anything additional, so.
Okay, planning board members' comments will go around. Paxton, you got anything?
yes, ma'am. I don't know if any of you know about the emergency that we experienced this morning. I was on my way to my office prior to visiting the sewer plant to check on my fencing contractor. And all I could see were fire trucks, ambulances, fire trucks, and officials on Gulf and Dolphin Drive blocking the road. So I pulled up and was advised by Scott Williamson, there was either a sewer line break or a gas line break, and to get out of there. So they didn't know what it was, but I could smell something as bad as my nose is. But so I went around the back way to Gulf and Dolphin by the sewer plant. And I'll be glad to take any of you on a tour at some point to show you the back way. And I had asked my operator of the sewer plant to unlock the gate off Enterprise so that my fence contractor can get it. But I'd just like to go through the parking lot of Gulf and Dolphin and check things out when I go to the sewer. Okay. Well, it turned out to be a gas leak, but there was no protocol. Here, I notified staff at McDaddy's. Once they go in the building, they have no reason to come out and look up and down the street. And I would earnestly request the town and the police and the fire department develop a protocol for notifying folks, you know, at some point during the day, they evacuated the shopping center, the Lowe's.
They did?
Yes, the Lowe's Foods people were sent out to the parking lot. I mean, we didn't have a protocol. So I'm earnestly requesting that for future emergencies, be it fire, be it gas leak, and whatever happened, I understood.
To communicate that information
Yes,
out.
sir. Yes, sir. To do that and not have a happenstance person just happen to see. I mean, we had lady bowlers in the building, and well, what's going to happen when they're ready to go? And I asked permission of the fire marshal. I went back and said, may we bring them out via the sewer plant if they're ready to go home and the road's blocked? And
Yeah.
I mean, nobody really knew what was going on. But that was a request to develop a protocol. And that might even be brought up at the July 4th fireworks meeting Thursday morning. We can be there.
I will.
Okay, so anyway, number two, very sorry that I had to miss the presentation of the living shoreline when it was presented here to the board, but I am gung ho on oysters and living shorelines. And there's some really good articles on sea level rise and how effective living shorelines can be, and hope that this board could be aware and promote that in our town. So those are my two issues. Sorry.
I don't have anything nearly as exciting as.
No,
It was scary. It was scary, you know.
Yeah, not knowing.
I didn't
The-
know. Everybody else
the-
went down to the house with it.
Oh, yeah.
those-
Even in neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods, we have that.
I'd like to get some of that.
Yeah, me too. right?
Well, you could.
Well, they're actually working on expanding the service to different neighborhoods. There's a new line going in on Holly Lane probably in the next month or two. And they're gradually doing that. To maybe put, I think the suggestion is a good one to keep in mind going forward. The good news is it was resolved relatively quickly after that. I think within about an hour, they had it resolved. And so thankfully it was nothing more serious. But to me, I think maybe, so there certainly are protocols in place for emergencies that those folks use. Obviously, it's all very situational depending on the issue at hand, the location, the threat, and all those kind of things. Certainly, we could do better. It sounds like maybe the bigger concern is just improving the emergency communications piece of it to the public, and that's something we can work on as a community, I think, going forward.
How did we do it when they had the hostage situation in the parking lot across the street? Remember that? That was like an all-day thing. And everybody knew about it. So there must have been something that went out.
I don't know. But it was just,
Yeah, you got anything?
I just wanted to say that whenever we're going through this table of permitted uses, we could spend an entire period on each one of these trying to slice and dice it. Whenever I'm looking at pages and pages and pages of this and trying to think about the implications and not having the experience that Paxton has to bring in you others, that I'm so impressed by the discussion, and I'm really honored to be a part of it, even though I don't feel like I'm really contributing all that much because I don't have the depth of understanding about the history of the town and how these things came to be and what the implications are. But anyway, I'm kind of in awe of it all. That's all. Comment only.
Yep, I don't have anything. Everybody already said that too. So all that's left is to adjourn. Can I get a motion? A second? All in favor?
yeah.
Paxton did not abstain from that.
Thank you.
That was welcome,
By the way, the
but it
Yankees
was
won.
on that.
So, although I'm not a Yankee fan, but they won. So
Even if it's
Was that game on this? I thought it was 8:00 tonight.
the game at 8 is the Padres and the Phillies. So, is that right? Yeah, the Yankees, that game was supposed to be last night. It got rained out, so they played at 4:00 today. And so the Yankees are moving on to play. It was, yeah. Yeah, TBS or TNT, one of those. Yeah, so I'm a Cardinals fan. It was a tough season.
So I'm always clipping little articles about, things that happen, especially in our area. I'd love to get out of the sewer. I would give a lot to get out of the sewer, but I haven't been able to. Well, that's what everybody keeps saying. So if it will.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I would do. Oh, God.
Yes, but that's the city of Memphis is what I say. Yeah. Yeah.
Changes.